I'm not a huge fan of the phrase, "okay boomer." Not that it isn't relevant to the stranglehold a certain generation has over politics in many countries, or that it isn't simply a humorous retort to the ravings of out-of-touch older people. I just tend to be overly sensitive to generalizing statements, I guess, especially those that have the power to disenfranchise a point of view not because of the words of the speaker, but because of some perceived undesirable aspect of their person, whether that be race, gender, or age. More so, I generally find generational discussions to place too much of an emphasis on homogenizing entire groups of people for the sake of typically flimsy narratives at best. Still, I have an equally sized problem with the phrase boomer shooter. Technically, if you really do care about the labeled generations, Doom and Quake were made by Gen Xers, and more importantly, culturally relevant to Gen Xers and Millennials. So why should we ascribe their creation and proliferation to boomers, who even in the 90s blamed violent video games for doom and all manner of social maladies? If we're generalizing. Still, I do know what boomer shooter means. It refers to FPS games of that era and retro games made today that carry their torch. My favorite game of this burgeoning genre is Ultra Kill, and that's what we're here to talk about. But first, let's figure out what the heck a boomer shooter is in the first place. For as long as I've played video games, I've lived in the shadow of the boomer shooter. The first video game I ever experienced was Duck Hunt, which has a rather peculiar take on what it means for a game to even be first person. But much more importantly, the first PC game I ever played was Doom. My dad had a LAN party at his house playing the classic game with a bunch of his friends, many of them computer geeks and programmers. They sat me down and had me play through Knee Deep in the Dead, the first chapter of the game. Perhaps this action contributed to a lifetime of video game love. Surprisingly, the extremely bloody violence wasn't on my dad or his friends' radars at all, despite the fact that I must have been around 5 or 6 years old at the time. The most salient memory I have of that playthrough is the bridge section of E1M3. I fell into the pit below and died, scrambling to get back to the high ground. I'm not afraid of heights today, but if I was, I'd probably be able to pinpoint exactly where that fear developed. Of course, Doom is the prototypical boomer shooter. Its tendrils could be felt in many other PC games I played in the 90s, like Hexen, Star Wars Dark Forces, and Quake. But by the time I reached my 10th birthday in 2001, such shooters existed mostly as a memory in my young brain. What changed in the 5-ish years between first playing Doom and then? Well, for one, my dad pretty much stopped playing video games, and he was the primary arbiter of PC gaming in my youth. In that vacuum, I would turn to handheld gaming and the Nintendo 64. It would still be a few years until World of Warcraft came out and I returned to the PC to get my fix. But the real culprit was console shooters. GoldenEye came out in 1997 and became my extended family's go-to game. We loved sitting around my grandma's basement, blowing each other up with landmines and laying into one another with machine guns. Then in 2001, Halo came out, and the idea of playing a FPS with a mouse and keyboard was almost irretrievably lost. I can't overstate how much Halo I played as a youngster. It was the game I played with other people until its sequel came out. And on its release day, I got Halo 2, an Xbox Live subscription, and everything was online. A world of people to play with. Boomer shooters, not yet called that, were outdated games by the mid-2000s that no one my age was playing. But Doom, like a tree planted, was steadily growing in the background of my life. What did the console generation of shooters have that Doom did not? The answer, quite simply, is other people, which should strike you as ironic, because my first experience of playing Doom was a social one, surrounded by people much older than me, cheering me on as I ventured into hell for the first time at a potentially inappropriate age. But the difference was all of my dad's geeky friends had to lug their computers all the way to his house for that LAN party, while me and my cousins could play GoldenEye provided we had a Nintendo 64 and 4 controllers. Not only was the same true for Halo, but we did have LAN parties with the much easier to transport Xboxes. Though the GameCube with that glorious handle could have easily won the LAN party competition if it had actually committed to being such a device. All this isn't to say that Doom failed or faded into irrelevancy, but for a good chunk of years, I suspect most people my age, ceased to view the shooter game as a single-player journey and more as a multiplayer slugfest. Such attitudes persist through today, but as gaming has grown larger, so too have the ways we play games. With a bigger market, there is an appetite for single-player experiences, not just those of the narrative variety, but some with the fast-paced zeal of Quake, the irreverent attitude of Doom. And with such a change enters the new era of the boomer shooter. Buoyed by the semi-dramatic rise of PC gaming over the 2010s and many people's nostalgia for a different kind of shooter, more games have started to harken back to a time when id Software was the biggest name in murder simulators. Both large and small developers jumped on this train. In the former, we can see the big-budget Doom and Doom Eternal, which, while not directly replicating their predecessors, did clearly try to evoke what made those original games great. Bethesda also got their feet wet in the genre in publishing multiple sequels to Doom's precursor Wolfenstein. There are plenty of indie games invested in recreating that 90s spirit, chief among them Ultrakill's publisher, New Blood Interactive, who also gave us Dusk and Amid Evil. There are many more good ones to name, and many I haven't even played, but I'll just chuck a recommendation for Devil Daggers here, a fun Rogue Doom-like experience. But we've yet to address the most important aspect of the so-called boomer shooter. What separates it from other FPS games? As with most things, there aren't hard and fast rules as to what gets to be included in the genre and what doesn't, but here are some themes. First, these nostalgic games tend to be more interested in style than realism. We can look back at the original Doom's simple color palette and sprites as primarily a limitation of technology at the time, but they have a unique charm to them. They are stylish and colorful. Boomer shooters don't often look like the original Doom, but they sure as hell do try to take a page from its book in their visual presentation. Compared to military shooters like Doom, or even more science fiction inspired shooters like Halo and Gears of War, which feature washed out, realistic graphics, modern boomer shooters care more about how the visuals serve the tone of the game rather than presenting something familiar to the player. Games like Devil Daggers are draped in intense black and red. Almost all of these games have similar dramatic lighting to back up their great gameplay. The indie games particularly tend to have simplistic graphics from the PSX era, but that doesn't detract from the experience because there's a beauty to such graphics. It gives them something similar to a found footage horror film like The Blair Witch Project, where grainier quality heightens the experience, evoking something like a memory for the player. As for gameplay, there is a lot of variety. I mean, just look at the difference between Doom and Quake. In just a few short years, we went from a primary horizontal experience to a great amount of interesting verticality. Primarily though, as far as FPS games go, boomer shooters turn up the intensity and ask the player to keep moving and keep shooting at all times. Whereas in a game like Gears of War, the player spends effort to find cover, waits for enemies to reload, flanks them, and works with teammates and AI, in a game like Dusk, there isn't much to hide behind at all. Instead, the player dodges slower projectiles, usually with a lot of circle strafing involved. This evokes the bullet storm type gameplay we can find in other fast-paced action titles as far back as Galaga. Guns don't often need to be reloaded, sometimes they don't even use ammo. These games want you to focus on running and gunning for as long as possible, and don't care much if they come across as overly difficult at first. Accessibility is good, and Ultrakill has a variety of difficulty options, but the gameplay here doesn't want to give you many different ways to play. It is upfront in its desire to get you to play fast and loose, swapping weapons and skills in a mad dash to get to the next violent encounter. As important to the boomer shooter as its aesthetic or gameplay is its bold irreverence. These games tend to not take themselves too seriously. Borrowing the spirit of Doom and Duke Nukem, everything is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. The characters and locations have a satirical edge to them, such as in Doom 2016's corporate monologues about how we need to get along with the demons. This bold, I am a game and you're gonna have fun playing me attitude is refreshing in an era where many popular shooters like Overwatch or Valorant take safe, predictable decisions much of the time. When I play boomer shooters, I don't feel like they were made for some great middle audience with something to appeal to everyone. I feel like they were made to surprise me and punch me in the gut. This is why, to me, the revitalization of the boomer shooter has less to do with going back to a previous era and more to do with evoking the spirit of that era. Doom Eternal and Ultrakill punch harder and faster than Quake did. Dusk and Devil Daggers have a vibrant and surreal presentation that would make even Doom 64 blush. It is often pontificated that fashion works in 20-year cycles, and while the new crop of boomer shooters may be a bit late, it feels like after years of safe shooters, there is a need for some games with edge, whether surreal or satirical, a hole that the boomer shooter fills quite nicely. And while I would argue almost every good game in the genre is thus not your dad's boomer shooter, Ultra Kill goes above and beyond, and is what we're going to spend the rest of the video talking about. Ultra Kill, even beyond the rebooted Doom or Dusk, has confidence and style. In it, you play as a robot on a journey through the 9 rings of hell. Sound familiar? Seriously, if there's one failure of the cascade of boomer shooters, it's their over-reliance on hell as a setting. The game's tagline, "Mankind is dead, blood is fuel, hell is full," directly evokes the bold tone of retro shooter games, which is what Ultra Kill bills itself as, but it's much more than just a retro shooter, I think. Its gameplay loop fits within what we've already described regarding boomer shooters. The player character is fast, and with a little practice dances on the battlefield with incredible alacrity. They have access to quite a few movement options, including short dashes, fast slides, dash jumps, and eventually a grappling hook. While zipping through these levels, the player faces hordes of enemies, intense boss fights, and the occasional puzzle. It feels satisfying to pull the trigger on each of its weapons, and finding a new one feels like opening up a Christmas present. My favorite of these is the Magnum, which you can flick coins in the air, and when you shoot them, they'll hit the weak spot of enemies. I absolutely love when the coin spikes into the gas pack of a nearby flamethrower enemy, causing them and all nearby enemies to explode. Importantly, Ultra Kill never lets up. It's a game that demands the player's full attention and rewards that attention with a blinding haze of carnage. In many ways, Ultra Kill is like Doom Eternal. For instance, both games significantly feature weapon swapping. In Doom Eternal, this is because ammo is scarce and different enemies are weaker to certain strategies and attacks than others. One way we can measure the boomer shooter relative to its contemporaries is in the amount of actions per minute the player is expected to do. In a game like PUBG, I might literally hide in a bush and take no actions for 30 seconds, which works for that game. But retro shooters try to max out the player's dexterity, force them to dodge an avalanche of projectiles while aiming and firing back at their foes. Weapon swapping then accomplishes two things. First, it objectively forces the player to just take more actions, as swapping to another weapon is an action, just like move left or left click to shoot. I did a quick measure of my actions in Ultra Kill's Cybergrind mode, and I swapped weapons an average of once every 5 seconds. In game, it feels even faster. The second boon of constant weapon swapping is that it keeps the player on their toes. I'm sure many have had the experience of picking up the sniper rifle in Halo multiplayer and having your entire disposition change. Now, instead of bulldozing into enemies, you park yourself someplace high, pick an edge of the field, and wait for unsuspecting prey to headshot. This is all fine and dandy, but when a game features, nay, requires, a high degree of weapon swapping, the player has no time to get comfortable. It keeps the hectic pace of the game going, rewarding the player with more enjoyment in the end for their efforts. While Doom Eternal punishes the player for not swapping weapons with limited ammunition, Ultra Kill tends to give the player the carrot rather than the stick. Each weapon in the game has special abilities. A shotgun with a grenade launcher, a machine gun with an overcharge, a railgun generating massive destruction. While there is unlimited ammo for these weapons, all of their special abilities have cooldowns. Once you flip 4 coins, you're going to have to wait a bit to do it again. Sure, someone could just sit on the shotgun with little ramifications, but they simply won't be getting the most out of their arsenal if they aren't constantly swapping to weapons with powerful abilities off cooldown. This feels a little bit like a MOBA game, where cooldowns also reign as the primary means of guiding the player through playing their character. What makes Ultra Kill shine in this regard is in how each weapon feels so satisfying that swapping to it doesn't feel like a chore, but an opportunity. Beyond this, each weapon has multiple permutations. There's more than one handgun, more than one shotgun, etc. And their abilities do not have shared cooldowns, so you can blow through all your cooldowns on one shotgun, then swap to the other to keep the chain going. Also, like Doom Eternal, Ultra Kill doesn't want the player kiting enemies too much or keeping their distance from them entirely. The game is simply more fun when you have to get up close and personal with your enemies. Doom Eternal yet again uses the stick of ammo to get you into melee range with disgusting demons. Using the chainsaw on a demon will spew out oodles of bullets for you to pick up and keep the action pumping. I love this mechanic, but I love the glory kills from the game even more, where meleeing a staggered enemy drops some health and finishes them off. I love Ultra Kill's brazen spirit just as much. In Ultra Kill, you have unlimited ammo but limited health, and whenever an enemy takes damage, they naturally bleed all over everything. That blood is your fuel and recharges your health. Thus, whenever you start to get low on health, instead of running away from enemies, you are forced to get in their face. A dangerous proposition to say the least, but that's exactly what I want out of a fast-paced, deadly shooter. Precarious situations, coming back from a sliver of health, high risks, and higher rewards. These rewards are furthered by the game's combo system. While functionally the game works fine without constantly grading your performance, the evaluations add the additional carrot of feeling cool while you're getting there. A big play is rewarded with a bright yellow Ultra Kill that tells the player they're doing it right. This further incentivizes not avoiding your enemies and safely picking them off from a distance, but finding spectacular and varied ways to blow them up. This part of the game has drawn comparisons to the Devil May Cry series, a game which I have woefully not played enough to comment on, but what I can say is we can even trace such roots back to the original id games, with titles like Doom giving the player a percentage of enemies they killed or secrets they found, encouraging them to view a playthrough of any given level not as just a stop on their journey, but a challenge to be replayed and enjoyed again and again. Such perpetual amusement, of course, wouldn't be possible without the base game being so addictingly fun. Ultra Kill is also a remarkably good looking game, especially considering it is going for a graphical quality that fits in more with Quake or the original Devil May Cry than its 2020 contemporaries. This look is perhaps the easiest part of the game to be cynical about. Might it just be aping the past for the point of nostalgia? But to ignore its charms is just as foolish as thinking Doom's gameplay is somehow dated. Ultra Kill's visual aesthetic most importantly keeps the player grounded in the action. With so much going on, especially in combat, the game's graphics need to be streamlined and easy to understand from one moment to the next. The simplified 3D graphics accomplish this well, and the game's expansive color palette keeps the onus on what the player needs to shoot and dodge rather than overwhelming them with visual stimuli. Moreover, Ultra Kill allows us to, at least slightly, revise some aspect of the past. Just as there are people who won't watch black and white movies, there are those who don't like to revisit the games of the past because they are dated graphically. But Ultra Kill reminds us that such games weren't ugly then and aren't ugly now. It subtly encourages the player to go back and try out some Quake or Doom, because style doesn't fade, and neither will Ultra Kill's unique, albeit nostalgia-tinted, look. Just like the id games of yore, Ultra Kill is full of secrets. The range of these secrets, their importance to the player, and the mileage one would get from them will vary, but suffice to say, Ultra Kill relishes in its secrets as much as it relishes in its devious combat. I truly don't want to spoil too much for the prospective player, as these things are best experienced in-game, and this is a bit of a recommendation video, so I will just tantalize you with the fact that a secret mission within the Lust segment of Hell includes a full-hearted nod towards the dating sim genre of all things. But perhaps Ultra Kill's most satisfying secret is not found in its campaign, but below, where the player selects the level they want to start, with wave after wave of perpetual arena violence called Cybergrind. Cybergrind takes the excellent combat of Ultra Kill and mixes it with the allure of a roguelike, randomized, endless replayability. Here is where the game truly shines. I have played hours of this mode, managing to crack the top 1000 finishes on Steam, and I can safely say that it is as addicting as speedrunning Crossy Road or Minesweeper. It's quick, it's dirty, it's fast, it's brutal. Everything good about Ultra Kill wrapped up in a neat package. My head literally buzzes after I finish a round, or rather am finished by a round. It's a rush more akin to an excellent Dota teamfight or Counter-Strike round than what I expect a single-player game to offer. A rush I'm sure to keep going back to for the next few months as I wait for Ultra Kill's next update. Still, the Cybergrind is fantastic and adds a ton of value to a game already worth replaying. This all adds up to an experience like a boomer shooter, but reaching and achieving so much more. Ultra Kill feels less like Doom or Quake and more like the dream or nightmare of those games come to life. It's not just as brutally delightful as Doom, it's as brutally delightful as your memory of Doom. It's not just as vomit-inducingly fast as Quake, it's as vomit-inducingly fast as your memory of Quake. Perhaps this feeling is best summed up in my favorite level of the game so far, Clair de Lune. This level opens in a strange way for the otherwise murderous Rampage game, with the relaxing piano chords of the song the level is named after and a find-and-seek puzzle section with no enemies to defeat. Little reason to pull the trigger on any weapon in your arsenal. Especially here, slowed down and more contemplative, Ultra Kill exudes confidence and style. The game and the player, by this point, have earned this short reprieve. But as the player solves the puzzles and moves forward, they face an enemy unlike any they've faced before, themselves. A phantom machine with all the player's abilities and their insane movement options. Here, the game and the player stare into the void of what they've become. Adrenaline junkies with an unquenchable thirst for blood. Gazing into such a void, they find it reaches out at them, grabs them by the throat, and pulls them in for more mayhem. This boss seems to suggest to the player, I'm you, but better. It is brutally difficult, quick on its feet, and inherently deadly, but in the end, after however many attempts it may take, it is the player, and perhaps Ultra Kill itself, that comes out on top. Outside of speedrunning in the game's amazing cyber grind mode, this is the closest Ultra Kill gets to a social experience, to the slugfest of Quake, a spectacular duel with one's self. But is it oneself, or a vision of one's past? A vision of Quake and Doom that the player is ultimately wrestling with. Like Jacob wrestling with God, Ultra Kill can't help but be made in the image of its forebearers. But it is in that struggle, that desire to push forward, do more, be more, that it ascends to the same heights as its progenitor. For what it's worth, Doom and Quake never had to live in the shadow of themselves. For Ultra Kill to do so and still succeed says something truly beautiful about the perseverance of both the genre and our will to keep making greater art despite the beautiful works that inspire and came before us. Many first-person games today do an excellent job of feeling grounded. They are balanced for multiplayer perfection, paced for single-player enjoyment, and their plots and characters attempt to be culturally relevant. What is special about Ultra Kill and the new wave of boomer shooters is in how they completely eschew this feeling. They are not stable, balanced, particularly well-paced, or trying to be deep or relevant. They truly feel a little unhinged. But in this insatiable desire for speed and violence, they lift off from game design that may appeal to the realist in us, flying into the stratosphere of enjoyment and intensity. You'll never get to experience Doom in 1993 revolutionize gaming again, but you can relive something close to it in the glory of Ultra Kill. And that alone makes it worth playing. I'm Error, signing off to rejoin the cyber grind.